Hi everyone. We're really glad to have you here today. I'm really excited to take you through the findings of our new paper, which is going to look at the potential for social media as a tool for peace building. And we're also going to hear from our panel of peace builders who are using social media in their work. So this session is designed so we can really think about the challenges and opportunities for building peace using social media as a tool. And we're going to take inspiration from peace builders using social media now, and also consider the challenges and opportunities for using social media that were raised in the paper. We're then going to work together in groups on a challenge that's designed to help us think through the issues and opportunities around using social for peace building. So in this short amount of time, we really don't expect any of us to be able to come up with a fully formed solution. And we know that in this time, we won't have a full understanding of the context needed to design a programme or a campaign, which we know as peace builders is obviously very important. But we wanted to provide some real world challenges that would enable us to drill down together into the questions raised in the paper and to learn from one another's experiences in the process. So with that in mind, we hope you all feel free to participate, knowing the challenges are really just set as a guide for discussion. So first we're going to hear from our panel. We'll then have a Q&A with the panel, and then I'll introduce you to the challenges before we break out into groups. So just to introduce myself, my name is Livi Santos, and I manage social media and digital engagement at International Alert. And before we start, a little bit of housekeeping. We're going to be recording the beginning of this session with the panel, and we'll share this on social media following the event, which is obviously quite apt because that's what it's about. So we won't share the recording from the breakout sessions, as we want us to all feel free to try out ideas and talk about the context where we work as well. But you'll notice it's recording just, for notes, so we can kind of reflect on what we've learnt. Please keep your microphones off while the panelists are speaking. If you have a question for the panel, please type it into the chat box. And lastly, I hope a lot of you use social media a lot, so please feel free to tweet about the workshop with hashtag BuildPeace2020. So first, we're going to have opening remarks from Christine Wilson, who's Head of Research at the British Council, who partnered with International Alert on this paper. And we're going to hear from Julian Egan, who's our Director of Advocacy and Communications at International Alert, who'll share the findings from the paper. And also just a special thanks to Build Up, who led on the research that was the basis for this paper. So over to you, Christine. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Livi. Morning, everyone, or good afternoon, I guess, depending on where you are. It's lovely to be here. My name's Christine, as Livi said. And it's great for me to be back at Build Peace, even in this virtual setting, because a couple of years ago, I gave a presentation at the conference in Belfast. And we were actually talking about the inspiration for this new paper that Julian's going to be talking about. And the session was called Social Media, Political Agency and Peace. And it honed in on some of the findings from a bigger piece of work British Council and International Alert had collaborated on, called the Peace Perceptions Poll. And just to introduce that as a bit of context setting, that looked at perceptions of and understanding of what makes for peaceful societies by what we would call ordinary publics around the world. What was their sense of what makes for a peaceful society? Is it just the absence of violence, or is it more the sort of positive peace context? And one of the interesting things we find, which was the stem of where we are today, was that overall, when we asked, who has a role to play in peace building, tech companies were very low down, really. People didn't really see tech companies as having a really big role to play. But when people were asked, one of the markers of a peaceful society was that people had confidence in their own political agency, but more importantly, how they could express it. That was seen as a sign of a peaceful society where people had that and they could express it freely. And then when the follow-up of, well, how do you express it? A huge amount of that was through social media, whether through connections, whether through organising campaigns and advocacy. So there did seem to be a little bit of a disconnect there in some way. And the question posed at that session a couple of years ago, so what is the role of tech companies and why are they not seen as potentially being able to drive forward positive peace building a little bit more? But when we reflected as sort of after the peace poll had come out, we really picked up on social media as one of three key themes that should be explored, and Julian will be talking about the findings of that paper shortly. The collaboration has obviously been really interesting for me. For those of you who don't know, the British Council, we are the UK's cultural relations organisation. But peace building is quite central to us as an organisation because we were founded in the 1930s in the face of rising fascism around the world, and a sense that better cooperation between the people of the UK and the rest of the world could only lead to more peace. And that has continued on as these days we tend to look at cultural relations as trying to understand what are the necessary conditions for cooperation in a world where sometimes it feels like it's very, very hard for people to cooperate, even when faced with major global challenges. And social media is particularly interesting for all of us right now. I'm sure I'm not the only one who hasn't been constantly glued to Twitter to try and be watching the US elections. And Twitter in particular has allowed me to see some really incisive, fabulous political commentary that I would not have had access to. It's given me real insight into the way people are thinking, but it's also given real insight into the terrifying speed at which rumor and hate speech can be shared and shared globally. And obviously that's one of the things I think we'll be looking at today. So it's a pleasure to be with you all. I'm really looking forward to hearing more about that. And Livi, should I hand straight over to Julian, or am I going back to you? Julian, then over to you. Thanks.
Great, thanks very much for that, Christine. I just wanted to start out this overview of the paper that we put together with a bit of a caveat, and that's that we're not an organisation who's an expert in this area. It's one reason why we partnered with Build Up, but for us it was really building off the poll, an opportunity to investigate about how we can potentially move forward in this space. And essentially in writing the paper, it's about sharing some of those ideas potentially with other organisations who are in a similar space at the moment. We really do hope that they'll be useful. But it's also why I'm really pleased that we can get together today to assemble this workshop so that we can continue that thinking journey. So I guess some scene setting up front. I think for me, coming to the end of this this piece of work and having learned a lot about this space, there seems to be a real sense of urgency in terms of peace builders and peace building organisations and the donors that support them really coming to grips with this area of work. If you look at the malign actors out there who are sowing the seeds of division and polarization and so on, technologically they are way out in front of us, and social media technology, it's just not mainstream yet within the peace building community. So sort of on that note, where do some of the opportunities actually lie for us to start delving into this space which just dominates so much of the modern political and social discourse. The first thing which became fairly clear to us, and in the discussions that we had with various peace builders around the world working on social media, was the potential of social media to really offer us new insights and perspectives in conflict context. So essentially to inform what is the basis for pretty much all peace building work, which is conflict analysis. Through, for example, mapping conversations, identifying those critical data sources. By way of illustration, in Lebanon, peace builders are researching social media narratives around that refugee host community tension. In places like Nigeria, they're using social media to map trends, actors, monitor themes, linked to hashtags, and all of this can come back in to inform the way that we operate in these contexts, and particularly inform program design. Another critical opportunity that I think social media represents for peace builders is amplifying peaceful voices. Well, we're all about shaping that public and political narratives. This is one tool that we could potentially make much more use of to carve out space for those people who are actually trying to promote that sense of social cohesion, whether that's countering fake news or threat narratives or what have you. To give an illustration that we note in the report, to combat hate speech, Peace Tech Lab has been working in close partnership with local peace builders and technology experts to identify and monitor hate lexicon on social media. And they're actually then explaining inflammatory language while offering alternative words and phrases that people can actually pick up and use to combat that hate speech, thereby reinforcing, amplifying, growing the ability to speak in peace-promoting terms. We felt that social media can also be used to create new spaces for people to connect, to coordinate, to mobilize around peace. But I guess you describe this as a traditional peace building organization, there's a lot of potential to actually use it as a tool for dialogue and certainly to augment what we're currently doing. In the Philippines, peace builders there are using Facebook groups to informally connect and convene those with shared conflict experiences, for example, and pairing these with offline training and dialogue groups as well. And this is something that the report really highlighted, this need to connect the online with the offline. And the report spells out the various reasons for that. But as I'm sure you'd appreciate, and I might circle back to this later on when we come to challenges, there's a real need to capture and connect those people who don't have a strong online presence with the dialogue process, which is starting in that online space. Interestingly, this same program has also used the online work as a means of recruiting people from online dialogue into offline dialogues as well, which is, I think, a really interesting model that we could potentially pursue more broadly. As I said, though, there are a number of challenges and constraints to social media becoming a mainstream tool within peacebuilding organizations and the donors and so on that support them. The first thing that became really clear was basically a deficit in basic knowledge and skills within peacebuilding organizations. As I'm sure all of you in the room would appreciate, engaging with social media does actually require a very specific set of capacities to monitor the various platforms and networks, to develop strategies, and importantly, put in place safeguards as well for the people that we're actually working with. Similarly, the tactics of the malign actors that I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, they're constantly shifting, which represents a significant added challenge for peace builders as well, who are just sort of entering into to this space and keeping pace of that rapid change, whether that's hate speak phrases or terms or other dimensions, is something that not only requires skills but is also quite time consuming as well. One conclusion that the report draws is that part of the reason, or I guess this sort of lack of skills, reflects the reality that peacebuilding organizations still tend to use social media as more of a strategic communications tool to extend what we're doing in that offline space, rather than using it as a vehicle in and of itself to promote and build peace. I think one of the other challenges that was highlighted as well was just harvesting and analyzing raw data. Again, a very complex process, whether that's sentiment analysis, or other forms of data analysis. But one of the key challenges is just access to that data in the first place as well. And there's probably going to be a need for greater collaboration between social media platforms, peace builders, donors, to really make sure that the data which is needed to undertake online peace building is available. Then we sort of run into that territory, which I think people are probably pretty familiar with, those legal and regulatory issues, which are sort of continually evolving. In a lot of contexts, the way that regulation is tracking can actually represent legal risks for peace building organizations. For example, in some environments, online messaging where it's sort of inconsistent with government narratives could actually be interpreted as falling into the criminal space. In Southeast Asia, for example, disinformation laws have been used to crack down on peaceful activists. So again, another dynamic and quite well, dynamic, evolving, and contextually specific challenge that peace builders will face as they come to use social media more fully. One thing which, an issue which is really unavoidable when it comes to social media and talking about it as a mainstream tool is the digital divide. I mean, it's a major issue in conflict-affected contexts across the board. Those that do have access to social media are often urban, educated, younger people. They have access to the technology and infrastructure and so on, which is simply not the case in some other areas of the country. We also talk about the gender digital divide as well, and that's particularly visible amongst rural women, for example, where access is more limited, literacy may be lower. But we even saw this to a certain extent when we were collecting our poll data as well. We did see a weighting towards men rather than women as respondents, and you have to correct for that when you're doing that data analysis. At the same time, though, peace builders are going to want a clear ethical framework as they apply across the rest of their work. And I think unless that's developed, unless it's very clear, that is going to be a bit of a disincentive to launch into this space wholesale as well. The final challenge that I wanted to highlight from the report is how do we know this actually works? So the monitoring and evaluation of impact and whether that's actually translating into real change. In particular, the report highlights the need to develop a deeper understanding of the connection between content, consumption, and behavioural change. I think it uses quite an interesting example, again from Lebanon, and it says that there was an interviewee participating in an evaluation of a program around countering fake news. This person was well versed in fake news. They clearly understood the tenets of fact checking. And so essentially the learning objective had been achieved. However, down the track, when they were presented with examples of fake news items, that individual was still reverting back to more sectarian judgments. So those sort of internal prejudices were resurfacing. So a lot of work had gone in, but ultimately that behavioural change hadn't flowed through. Which sort of brings me to opportunities to face down some of these challenges. I'm going to give you a flavour. I'm not going to go through them individually because I think we're here today to actually talk about how we can really capitalise on social media as a tool for peace building. But to give you an idea, they span things like greater collaboration between donors, companies and peace builders to enhance that data sharing that I was talking about, but also a two-way skills exchange. So for example, peace builders, they need better skills in the social media place, but tech companies also need to be much more cognizant of how their platforms interact with conflict dynamics on the ground and ways that they can go about ensuring that they do no harm but maximize the potential to contribute to peace in those contexts. I've already mentioned there's an opportunity around the greater utilization of social media to link to and complement that, the dialogue work that peace builders undertake, really underpinned by drawing on social media as a tool to really enhance our conflict analysis too, which is the bedrock of peace building across the board. And as I've just said, I think establishing that evidence base for behavior change is key, not only because we want to know that this work is actually having an impact, but we need to be able to assure donors that their funds are making a difference. And if we can't do that, we're unlikely to be able to really scale work in this area to maximize the full potential of social media as a peace building tool. So on that note, I want to stop there because I think now is the time to really hear from people who are actually doing this on the ground to get a sense of their experience and the way that they have actually been capitalizing on social media to build peace in their respective contexts. So on that note, I'm going to hand back to Livi.
Right, thanks, Julian. And yes, we're going to be sharing the paper in the chat here so everyone can have a read following the event as well. So yeah, hopefully you all find it insightful. So yes, now on to the our panel. So we're going to hear from a panel of peace builders, as you said, who are using social media in their work already. So we're going to hear from Thant, who's Tech for Peace Manager at Phandeeyar, Yangon-based NGO, where they lead a team promoting social cohesion in Myanmar through digital and media education. And they also research, Phandeeyar do a lot of research in the social media space as well. A is also a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist who's covered business, politics and conflict in Myanmar, Thailand and the United States. Next up will be Dr. Medinat Abdulazeez Malefakis, who many of you will have heard her in a keynote speech yesterday at Build Peace. And if you haven't, there's a recording, so I'd very much recommend to go and have a listen. Medinat is a research and information analyst for West, East and Southern Africa at the ACAPS programme, hosted by the Norwegian Refugee Council. And her research specialisms include violent extremism, religious fundamentalism, conflict, social and violent conflict, and post-conflict resettlement, rehabilitation and reintegration, among other specialisms. And she was interviewed as part of this paper for her research on social media dynamics in Boko Haram's terrorist insurgents. And then following Medinat, we'll have Maureen Lacuesta, who is Senior Communications Officer at International Alert Philippines. Maureen handles strategic communications, content creation and public outreach for the Alert Philippines programme, and was also, our Philippines programme were also interviewed as part of this paper, so you'll find some ideas from their work within that too. And she manages Alert Philippines social media accounts and is also involved in research projects involving online communication. So as a reminder that you can ask your questions at any time for the panel in the chat. And yes, I'd like to just, yeah, over to you, A, please.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay, great. Thank you for the introduction. I would like to reiterate what you just said, Livi, in terms of watching the keynote speak yesterday. I found that to be really inspirational, and I found a lot of resonance with Myanmar, as well as, you know, former British colony, but also a geopolitical creation, in that it was a number of very disparate peoples and groups and political structures that was kind of smashed together through the process of colonization, and who are now dealing with the aftermaths of that process, but also do need to take agency for what is happening now, right? And not sort of continually saying, well, this happened in the past. And yeah, we're working on those issues. And so my organization, Phandeeyar, is a tech-focused NGO in Myanmar, and we're working with all manners of technology. So, you know, we're not just focusing on social media, but we also do a lot of things around, for example, robotics, as well as startups. And we really try to look at how we can use technology to promote both economic growth, but also social cohesion in the country. And so, you know, what, for example, with our RoboLeague, one of the things we're trying to do is help young people get more interested in robotics, especially those who are in rural areas, who have less access to STEM education. But in the process of that, we are also looking to bring together people who may have never really interacted with people outside of their ethnic group or their religious group, and bring them together and to show them that we have these sort of shared interests, and just a shared humanity outside of, that goes beyond sort of the propaganda they have been taught, either from the elders in their communities or the propaganda in, honestly, a lot of our history books and our schooling system. But I think today I really want to talk about what my team is doing, as well as what the research team is doing that Livi referenced earlier. My team is called Tech for Peace, and we really work on three main things, which is capacity building, social media campaigning, and advocacy. So in terms of capacity building, we work with a number of different actors. Right now, I would categorize them in sort of three general groups. The first of which is socially influential people. These include teachers, politicians, people who are kind of in positions where they are seen as those we should respect just because of either their age or their positions, either financially, economic, or through their jobs or whatever it is. Peace builders is the second group, and then the third group would be the general public. With capacity building for these socially influential people, we're really trying to teach them how to use social media in ethical ways that would model positive and ethical behavior for those that they would be in a position to influence. So what we are really trying to, or what we really hope to see after our trainings and interactions with these groups is for them to, one, stop engaging in hate speech and misinformation on their own, start to be able to recognize these sorts of things, but also have better digital security so that their positions of influence, especially online, are not leveraged by bad actors, by people sort of hacking into their accounts or creating fake accounts in their names in order to spread divisive messages. And then with the peace builders, we really are trying to follow the lead of local organizers on the ground. You know, Myanmar is, there's over 135 ethnic groups in the country. People speak dozens, if not hundreds of different languages, depending on how we're classifying languages. And just because of the poor transportation infrastructure, if you don't live in a place, you genuinely do not know what the local context is and what's happening. And so we really want to build local organizers' capacity in order to spread their message, especially using social media. And then the last thing is we work with the general public to really just promote ideas of digital literacy to help people start to understand the technology that they're using, to understand really how algorithms work, how social media kind of uses human psychology in order to funnel people into certain groups, especially since Myanmar got the internet quite late. The majority of people didn't start using the internet until 2010, and internet hasn't really become, or it didn't really become affordable until the last few years. And so while we deal with a lot of the same problems that people in a lot of other countries are also dealing with, we're also dealing with a population of people who went from like hand cranked radios to smartphones in less than 10 years. And so there's another level of difficulty in getting people to understand that what is now a glass box, and how it works and how they can use that safely and how it can also be used to manipulate and use them in negative ways. And then in addition to our capacity building, we also work on social media campaigning of our own. In the past, we used to do a lot of debunking and counter messaging. And what we found was that, I think like other speakers at this conference have said, that's really exhausting and not always helpful in that we're often restating the claims that we're trying to debunk in the first place, which psychologically doesn't help. And so now we've moved on to a sort of Humans of New York type social media campaign where as we travel throughout the country, or before COVID, we would interview a lot of people and ask people to tell us their stories or to tell the public their stories, especially because of both the geographical but also social divide in the country. People don't really know that much about their neighbors, especially if their neighbors are multiple villages away or even in another state or region. And so we really want to utilize people's voices and showcase stories that are either not told through our history and social science curriculums or featured in mainstream media. Or if they are featured, they're featured in very stereotypical and derogatory ways. And then the last thing we do is advocacy. Facebook, in part because they've gotten a lot of pressure through both the international media, but also in the US, in terms of their role in the Rohingya genocide and the current state of social media in Myanmar today. I think, although we can argue that Facebook has done inadvertently or either through neglect done a lot of harm globally, the Myanmar case has gotten a lot of attention. And so we have, as civil society in general, have had a lot of access to Facebook, which doesn't necessarily translate to social change, but it does get us in the room to kind of yell at them about once a month with a number of other CSOs backing us up. And yeah, and I think a lot of this research is also possible because Phandeeyar also has a research team that really helps us understand what's happening in Myanmar social media. And this research team also is collaborating with other organizations all throughout Myanmar. So, you know, like I said earlier, it's very difficult to know exactly what's happening on the ground in Myanmar unless you're really there. And so we've been collaborating with a lot of civil society organizations all throughout the country to create these social media monitoring reports that we create and have available for all organizations throughout the country so that we can, regardless of what our individual organizations are focusing on, we can create programming, but also make necessary changes as situations on the ground change. And so a lot of these reports come out weekly. So you can know on a weekly basis what are the trending posts in the country. There are COVID specific ones, there's election specific ones, and all of these allow us to see, you know, what kind of posts are trending, who are the actors whose posts seem to have the most draw, what are people talking about, and we can make educated guesses about what sort of conflicts might kick off because of these narratives that are forming, which allows us as peace builders to start to counteract them in different ways. So my team, for example, with our social media campaign, you know, when COVID became a thing, we tried to interview more Chinese people, we tried to interview people who had been patients to try and limit the panic. We interviewed people who were poor and were living sort of day to day to sort of try and create empathy for especially migrant workers who continue to travel or who had come back to the country and who were being stigmatized. And so I think something to take away from what we're doing in Myanmar is that collaboration really is key, that there's so many things happening all the time that there is no way for any one organization to do a lot at once. But if we kind of create open data sources and share what we know, even if it's not useful for our organization at that moment in that in the specific work we do, we can, the work we've created can still help others. Yes, I will send a link. Although I think our website's updated. So, but yeah, that's it for me.
Thank you so much, A. And yes, that was really very interesting. And yeah, I'll move over now to Medinat, please.
Good day, everyone. Thank you very much for having me, and thank you, I, for pointing out the how similar conflict context can actually be. I didn't know a lot about how similar the two countries were until you mentioned it now. Today, I would try to give flesh to what Julian spoke about earlier, about what the basis of this report is, especially in the Nigerian context, and how we researchers basically use social media in order to build peace. And for this report, and also for my own work specifically, we rely on social media for the conflict analysis part of peace building. And we do this because we have realized that social media, just as it can be used for conflict context, can also be used for peace building. But the reason why we are very specific to using social media for conflict analysis is, first of all, for example, when we do things like mapping actors, which is one of the things that we use social media to do, it is because we realize that the Boko Haram space, the conflict space where Boko Haram operates, they don't use social media for recruitment, which is what most terrorist organizations use social media for. And the reason why Boko Haram does not use social media for recruitment is because their context or the spaces where they operate, the people who they would want to recruit, they're not literate enough, they're not digital literate, they're not formally literate enough in order to be able to use social media efficiently. So what they do, or what we do, because we don't have this space, is that we use social media to map out actors who have proven over time to have access to Boko Haram. And this access that they have to Boko Haram is the through building of relationships with them, whatever kind of relationship it is that they have built with them. We peace builders who do conflict analysis have to rely on these actors who give us some kind of first-hand information that we would never have gotten if they were not there. And for Boko Haram, there are two actors. Of course, there are a lot of them, but there are two of them who stand out. One of them is Ahmed Salkida. Ahmed Salkida is one of the journalists who have been proven to have direct connection with the first leader of Boko Haram. And currently also, he has the lines of communication with Boko Haram that most people do not have. And that's why we peace builders, when we are analyzing the Boko Haram conflict, we have to rely on him as an actor. Ahmed Salkida was the journalist who actually had the proof of life video for the abducted girls, like the 300 abducted girls, the Chibok girls. And so this is like a kind of connection of line of communication that nobody has. And that's why we have to rely on people like this as important actors in the context of Boko Haram's conflict. Another example of actors that we have to rely on is Bulamo Bukarti, who is a researcher. For some reason has gotten, he appears to be very, very well versed in his understanding first, but also in his analysis of how Boko Haram works. And he appears to be so important that Boko Haram also, they've mentioned Bulamo Bukarti in their videos a lot of times, threatening him, asking him to stop saying the truth about their organization. So these kind of actors for us are very important because of the way Boko Haram operates in this conflict context. And that's why we use social media to build peace, but to map out actors. The second way we use social media in conflict analysis is to map out conversations. So of course we understand that the overarching overarching theme for this conflict context is Boko Haram, but we have seen through the use of social media that sometimes specific conversations are remapped out from the general conversation. So for example, Boko Haram is the conflict context, but at specific times, the conversation of Boko Haram is not about Boko Haram. It's about something that Boko Haram has done, which at that point is more important to the populace, is more important to the conflict context than Boko Haram itself. And I give you an example. When the breakout faction of Boko Haram ISWAP, when they kidnapped not the Chibok girls, but the Dapchi girls, when they kidnapped another set of girls and returned them, they didn't return one of them, Leah Sharibu. And the reason why they didn't return Leah Sharibu was because she refused to renounce her Christianity to become a Muslim. So they held on to Leah Sharibu even though they released the other girls. And at the time when this happened, we realized that the conversation about Boko Haram was not about the conflict itself, but it was focused more on this refusal to release Leah Sharibu, so much that now every year, when it's her birthday, which is on May 16th, social media influencers, social media users put her picture on their profile in order to put this specific aspect of the Boko Haram conversation on the burning table, and to also put pressure on the Nigerian government to not forget this girl. So we realized that yes, the general context of the conversation might be conflict, but at times, depending on what is happening about the conflict, the conversations have been streamlined to specific aspects. And so that's why we as peace builders, we use social media to map out the specific conversations about that conflict context when we're doing peace building. Apart from mapping out actors and mapping out conversations, we have realized that for peace building, we have to understand what the public or political perspective about that conflict is at that time. And this is also one of the veritable tools that we use social media for. Like I said, the general overarching theme might be conflict, but we realized that in the context of Boko Haram, for example, there is a tendency for the Nigerian government and indirectly the Nigerian military to monopolize information about the conflict dynamics. For example, the Nigerian military, they have social media handles where what they publish mostly It's always about situations that show that they are in charge of this conflict, that they are winning the conflict. They use their social media handles to show, for example, counterinsurgency operations that have been successful, according to the military. They show pictures of insurgents who have been killed and captured. They show pictures of themselves, the military, freeing captured people under Boko Haram's captivity. And they also show how they have recovered arms and ammunition. And what the military and the Nigerian government, because as far as in the context of Boko Haram, the Nigerian military and the Nigerian government are one and the same in the eye of the populace. What they try to do is to show that they are winning this conflict. They rarely show, for example, fatalities that have been suffered by the military. They rarely show if a counterinsurgency operation was not successful. They try to push the narrative that everything is going on well with the insurgency. But with social media, peace builders have been able to understand the conflict context is mostly not what the Nigerian military or what the Nigerian government is trying to make us believe. And so we have seen, for example, people on social media who have shared videos or pictures that dispel some of the reports that the military has tried to push on. And so for us as peace builders who analyze the conflict context, we need to understand what exactly is the public or political perspective and to understand which part is right and which part is wrong. And for us, this is very, very important. In the context of shaping political and public perspective, I want to use another conflict context to analyze how we do this. And this is for the EndSARS social protest. A lot of times when EndSARS started, the government totally ignored the protesters and their agitations online because they didn't believe that the SARS operatives were doing such horrible jobs as the people wanted the government to believe. But it was only through social media that we saw videos of attacks, videos of extortion, videos of arrest of SARS operatives. So when the public or when the political perspective is geared towards one line, we realize that social media has helped us to analyze the conflict and realize that this is not what is happening. And so for us as peace builders who analyze conflicts, this is very important. I think now I want to talk about the challenges that we have experienced as peace builders who are analyzing conflicts in the Nigerian context. I know what well, Boko Haram is like but for me, EndSARS demonstrated for us how tech companies, when they are conflict insensitive, can actually aggravate the social conflict. And I use an example, of course, EndSARS. When the conflict started on October 3rd and people started to tweet about it, there was a shift on the conversation. This is a conversation that had been happening online every year since 2017. But for 2020, there was a shift from how much attention EndSARS would get, because in the weekend that followed, there were already 28 million people, 28 million tweets about EndSARS itself. And this drew the attention of the Twitter CEO himself, who by himself tweeted on his page about the conflict. He verified some very active members of the movement who were helping to mobilize people. And he also gave a special, or Twitter gave a special emoji to the EndSARS movement. But what happened with Instagram was that we realized that Instagram was blocking the posts of people who were tweeting, for example, very horrifying videos from the protest grounds. Instagram refused to allow some people, actually block the accounts of people. And people at this time, with how sensitive the environment was, they started to tweet boycott Instagram because they assumed, or what they thought was that the Nigerian government has somehow gotten Instagram to refuse to allow people to talk about this. So they felt that the government had somehow influenced Instagram to not help the protesters and to not allow people to know what's happening about this. And this kind of aggravated the whole social media space at that time. And this shows that when tech companies, for whatever reason, Instagram claimed that they had technical issues, but it was very obvious that it was only technical issues that was related to the EndSARS movement, because all other posts were not having these technical issues. So we realized that when tech companies refuse to be conflict sensitive, this is a challenge because it complicates the entire conflict situation, and it makes it very, very impossible for we to analyze the conflict context at this time. The last challenge that we have experienced, or we are still experiencing, when it comes to analyzing conflict for peace building in Nigeria is the continuous attempt by the political elites and the government of Nigeria to regulate social media based on their own assumption that for some reason social media is helping to spread fake news and is inciting some people against the other. But we have realized this is not new. The kind of regulations they are trying to implement are regulations that are more politically influenced than influence based on what or the way social media is affecting, is inciting people against each other. And this for us complicates the conflict analysis space that we would want to use as peace builders. I would like to conclude this to say that we also have the same problem when it comes to the inability of conflict analysts to reach people who do not have access to, for example, technology, internet connectivity due to whether illiteracy or due to any form of like people who, for example, like Julian talked about, women have been the people who have not been able to reach, and also illiterate people who do not have access to social media, one of the people that we as conflict analysts are unable to reach. And this kind of does not give us a full picture of what the conflict context might be. And this kind of is a big challenge to analyzing conflict or peace building in the Nigerian context. I would like to stop here and hand over to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you. Over to you, Mal.
Yes, hello everyone. Good morning. Thank you for having me. So I would just like to in this session to tell a specific story of how social media played a vital role in one of our advocacy to push important local actors to support the Marawi compensation bill. So in March 2020, a bill was filed in the Philippine Senate, and it was championed by 5 senators of the majority bloc. So the bill was for the Marawi compensation. It's an important milestone for the people who were displaced, the internally displaced people, who until this date continue to suffer the effects of the Marawi war 3 years since. So that bill was important because it's not about just merely compensating the people, but it recognized the private sector as important local actors in Marawi. So Maranaos, or the people who lived in the city, as what they are called, were known to be entrepreneurs. And the bill included specific provisions that provide monetary compensation for the loss and damages of private infrastructures, and also included cultural and religious infrastructure. So that bill, as well as the senators who authored the bill, recognized that the state has the moral and legal obligations to help the victims. So just to give you everyone a brief background of what happened in Marawi in 2017. So 3 years ago, ISIS forces took over Marawi City. So Marawi City is also known as the Islamic City in southern Philippines, where there are around 200,000 people who live there. So the battle continued for 5 months until the government declared the city liberated after it launched surgical operations, aerial attacks that, according to them, they deemed was needed in an urban warfare. So after that war, thousands died and hundreds of thousands were displaced. And during that 5 months, people were trapped inside their homes. So people were trapped in the crossfire, fearing for their lives. But I would like also to give this opportunity that even though, despite the massive destruction during the Marawi siege, heroism actually shone through among the Maranaos, among the people, because during the war, so it was the powerful people or the clans who stayed behind to save their loved ones, and also extended that to those they didn't know. So they did this because of their so-called maratabat, or honor. It's an important shared value of the Maranaos that cut across faith, religion, and ethnicity. So after the city was liberated, so after that 5 months, so there were a lot of noise, there were a lot of clamor from the people. There were questions among the displaced. They were asking, when will the rehabilitation start? Why is it taking slow when people are continually suffering in camps and staying indefinitely with relatives outside the city? They were asking who should be accountable for losing their homes, their properties, and their loved ones. So it was this time that International Philippines conducted consultations with clans, with local businesses and community members which aimed to help government complete its comprehensive rehabilitation plan for the city. So during that process, the locals during that consultation surfaced that there is a need to continue those consultations and dialogues to ensure that there is a transparent, accountable, and effective rebuilding process. And then that's when Alert formed the Marawi Reconstruction Conflict Watch, or we call it MRCW for short, to answer the need for an autonomous, independent, multi-stakeholder group to continuously monitor the rebuilding of the Marawi to ensure that it does not lead to further escalation of conflict because people were frustrated, and that the rehabilitation truly responds to the needs of the people. So members of the MRCW come from different sectors and backgrounds, but they share a common identity of being displaced, and they were all from the city, from Marawi. So given the issues and grievances, Alert and the MRCW identified the narrowest objective that we can work on, regardless of differences in interests, opinions, position in society. And we all agree that it is important that Maranaos are able to rebuild their lives, and that compensation is imperative so they can do so. Their differences, because the membership were coming from different sectors, like I said, they didn't stop them from working together on this issue. So the body, the MRCW, served as an important bridge between the state and the citizens for voicing that advocacy and other grievances, and in turn resolving potential dispute that may arise in the reconstruction process. So the MRCW at the same time was successful in keeping the conversation on the Marawi compensation bill going among the general public, even amidst the COVID-19 pandemic, and the measures and processes to enact that bill into law continue to move forward up to that date. So how did we do that? How did we get to win that Marawi compensation bill? So first, I'd like to share some three elements. So first was that we harnessed social networks in multiple levels. So local governments, the clans, early response network, women and youth, so national bodies and the legislation. So Alert was able to form the MRCW because we had connections to these social networks, and it was important to harness them. So why? Because we know that it is really the local people who are the closest and are most vulnerable to conflict. But at the same time, they have the knowledge, they have the capability, and the agency to resolve issues in their own communities. And then second, we harnessed their social capital. So MRCW members were very well placed in their communities, and they themselves lend their own credibility to the group. So by them demonstrating that credibility and legitimacy led them to become resource persons in different avenues and platforms, such as important committee hearings in the Congress, lobbying in the Senate, and Alert in turn provided technical assistance and accompaniment to the process, and also shared crucial data and analysis to strengthen that shared advocacy. So the MRCW's members, vast networks also amplified the issue in each of their own organizations and networks. And lastly, social media, of course, is an integral component in that advocacy. Like what Julian said earlier, so we do a lot of online and offline work. So aside from those offline work, it was through social media that we were able to utilize our social networks, our social capital, by putting the Marawi issue into the public consciousness and to also exert external pressure. So we did launch online campaigns during relevant events, such as the anniversary of the Marawi siege and the Marawi liberation. So during those times, it kept the discussion going, and it prompted key legislators to also push for the issue. And aside from social media as a public platform, we also utilized it for also our internal purposes. So we all know that contexts change fast in conflict-affected areas, and there is a need for quick information and to respond to these immediately. So as Alert, so we identified what's the easiest way for us to reach them, and we found out that it was through Facebook chat groups. It provided a safe space for the members to present updates, issues, and to share also their own perspectives. It was important that at the start they had a clear objective, a shared goal, and as a group, in those chat groups they were actually self-regulating and mediating the group by themselves. So Alert, we as members and secretariat of the group, we also give updates on important committee schedules and developments. At the same time, the MRCW also gives updates on the ground, which are important to ensure that the information that we present to key stakeholders truly reflects the reality and what is happening in their locality. So through social media, we were able to quickly develop press statements, for example, releases. It was through those internal communications through chat groups. And in turn, these were projected in our public platforms, which led to the group's credibility on the issue. So those were all integral in the success of the Marawi Compensation Bill. It was filed by the powerful bloc in the Senate, and the use of social media played a big role in it. But I would also, as to conclude, I would just like to set a reminder that this story is a reminder that social media cannot stand on its own based on our experience. We all know that it's not a debate that social media is a very powerful tool. However, if we are to truly push for institutional change for policy, um, social media cannot do it on its own unless you ground it to face, hard-nosed, detailed word lobbying, advocacy. So it will only create positive change when you actually put hands and feet to it. And yeah, it's still about partnerships and how the clarity of the objective of how you will be social media. So that's it.
Thank you so much, Mal, and to all of the panel. That was really, really interesting insights into the work that you do, and a very varied set of approaches show really kind of, you know, it's a tool for peace building, but it's just so contextual in the way that you will look at it and analyze it and decide how to use it. So yeah, really interesting to see the kind of different approaches. And also there's a lot of crossover. So, you know, the ideas around identifying mapping conversations and influential actors, and then those ideas of how to actually translate that research that you've done into how you mobilize people or change our approach as peace builders. So it doesn't necessarily the kind of, yeah, the peace building approach could be just the research in itself, or it can be to then like go, like, you know, mobilize people for advocacy and those kind of things. So yeah, really fascinating to hear the different approaches. So yeah, we've had a lot of interesting questions in for the panel. One for everyone, this one from Charlotte, which says, to what extent speakers and participants believe it is possible for social media actors, that's the platforms themselves, so tech companies, to become conflict sensitive? Do you believe that business models allow for the potential for do no harm or meaningful conflict sensitivity? And I think, yeah, just to add, like a couple of you had examples there of, you know, social media companies trying to be sensitive or trying to do certain things and it actually backfiring in the conflict context. So I suppose it's just interesting to know how you think, you know, if we think about, and obviously like you've worked with tech companies with your CSOs, and Medinat, you kind of saw, you know, Instagram cracking down on what they thought was harmful content. So yeah, I guess where, like, is there room for optimism? Can they be conflict sensitive? And yeah, where are the opportunities there?
For me, I would say definitely, and it's the same example with the NSAS protest, because for me that is like the most recent and the most vibrant in the minds of the people. When the protest was going on, social media was, and I'm talking about Twitter and Instagram, they were the only avenues for people to know what was going on at the protest grounds, what was happening with the youth who were organizing, how much had been crowdfunded, how the protest was almost too perfectly organized. And this was because at the time, because of the sensitivity of the issue, the Nigerian government had directly or indirectly gagged mainstream media from talking about the protest at this time. Most of the media organizations, most of the TV stations were not talking about this. They were not airing the protest. And this was so bad because at a point in time when the protest was hijacked, there were TV stations which were burnt down because the hoodlums who hijacked the protest, they assumed that they believed that what the TV stations were airing was fake news, and they were not talking about the correct incidences that had happened. And at this time, when mainstream media was not reporting about the protest and social media was the only avenue to hear about it, it was, for me, insensitive for Instagram to say they had technical issues in this context. Like, you don't have technical issues in this kind of situations. And then you cannot use technical issues to explain away this kind of misdemeanors, because, like we said, technical issues did not affect all of the users who were sharing other content that was not related to NSAS. It was very specific to people who were sharing videos of what was happening on protest grounds. It was specific to people who were sharing the videos of people who had been killed, or the people whose, like, as the protest was going on, police was still brutalizing people and arresting people. And the people who Instagram had technical issues related to were just people who were sharing this. So if you want, for what Twitter did might be seen as partisan in some way. But if you're partisan to something that is the truth, I don't know if that should be seen as being biased in a negative way or something. It was for me, it was normal that Jack would tweet about the protest. It's something that was happening in the world. And for something that had garnered for Twitter 28 million tweets in just how many days, I don't see this as being biased. For me, it's just you saying what you feel is happening. If I tweet about something about the US elections, for example, it doesn't show whether I'm biased or not. So being sensitive does not have to equal to being biased. And I don't think that social media organizations should shy away from, for example, showing where they stand on specific issues, especially if you know that this is the truth. And if you know that this does not incite people. Who Twitter, Jack, ended up inciting was, of course, the Nigerian government in this context. But for me, it was just you showing your position. I do not think that being conflict sensitive in this kind of very polarized situations, I don't think it's too much to ask. And I think that they can do it if they want to. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
I would second that in that I think where a lot of these companies mess up, or the way in which a lot of these companies end up having negative impacts, is they're not investing enough resources ahead of these conflicts or ahead of entering these countries or promoting their products in these countries to really understand how their technology may be used to harmful effects, right? Like I really hate the narrative that Facebook caused genocide in Myanmar, because it didn't. It may have exacerbated existing issues. People may have weaponized Facebook as a way to organize violence in the offline world, but Facebook entering Myanmar is not the sort of inciting incident that led to genocide. But at the same time, I do think a lot of these organizations, they don't think about what impact they'll have, that if they just talk to a few people before they make decisions, it would be quite clear. And considering that these are multi-billion international corporations with all of the money and resources they could possibly want. And none of these conflicts are surprising, right? If you study history, maybe the sort of exactly where it starts or exactly when it starts is a surprise, but all of these things for the most part are long-burning issues. It should be part of the risk analysis. And I think it's a sort of institutional failure that it's not.
I'd just like to add to that. There's so much debate in Facebook that how people are saying that social media is actually it's actually dividing people more than uniting them. But I'd like to make this point that social media is a very fertile ground. It's not just for eyes and ears on emerging issues or identifying issues or that polarizes people, but it's also a platform where we can monitor critical events and tensions that's happening, like what are the conversations being shared online, what are those messages, for example, that instigate hate or fear or discriminate. But at the same time, I'd like to make the point that that social media in itself does not solve issues. So it should be accompanied by offline activities to influence and push for policy change. So, for example, when we see conversation online that we see dividing, or we see tensions in communities, so we harness those by we immediately contact our partners on the ground to verify what's really happening on the ground, and to see in what ways we can help.
Thanks very much. Really interesting answers, and a sort of a big challenge for us, but also for tech companies. So I suppose it's that question of how, you know, I think it's an amazing example of like how Phandeeyar and other CSOs are kind of banding together. Like you said, like collaboration is key in kind of influencing these tech companies, and like how are people in other contexts doing that, and, you know, I guess how do we get them to address this basic things that they could be doing to make themselves more conflict sensitive, like having conversations with people who live in the countries where they work. So yeah, I think a really nice opportunity for us to learn from one another on how we're trying to do those things as well. So yeah, some more questions as well come through. So a question from Caleb, who also interestingly was researched as part of this paper for when he used to work at Peace Tech Labs, who worked on, well, you can give a brief explanation if you want, kind of. And he has a question for the panel. So with Facebook limiting access to its API and back-end access to data, how are you all monitoring Facebook Spaces, and any thoughts about private chat apps? Do you see polarizing conversations moving from private spaces to public spaces, or do they tend to stay private? Actually, I just realized your mic's not on, but Caleb, if you wanted to introduce Peace Tech Labs, or I can give a brief overview. They work on a lexicon of hate speech. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, so very quickly, it was just a question on social media. As you're monitoring social media, and Facebook being one of the common platforms, how do you get around to do that? Do you work with teams on the ground? Do you do it yourselves? Is it like manual monitoring? Do you have connections with Facebook? Because I've heard some organizations are working directly with Facebook. And also the last one was the question of conversations moving from WhatsApp to public spaces, or from Telegram. Like, do you see that cross content polarization where it's brewed in these dark spaces and then it's like explodes on the net? Yeah, and we can talk about the work we did at this Tech Lab later. Thank you.
Thank you. Would anyone in particular like to take that first?
Maybe I can share a bit based on our experience here in the Philippines. I think with Facebook groups, we all know that there are also ethical considerations when you try to access private groups, but we'd like to think that, for example, radicalization per se, although we haven't like tested it really if radicalization really happens online, but based on our experience, it's really radicalization happens offline. So they use issues such as poverty, discrimination to instrumentalize or to push people to push vulnerable people to join violent VE groups, for example. And while we see there are some issues that are polarizing, meaning like really dividing people, like for example, anti-Muslim and anti-Christian sentiment, I think there's really a need to study how does that actually translate to offline activities, or like how do we actually measure if that specific incident or conversation is really polarizing enough that may lead to offline activities or something. So yeah, I think there are ethical considerations to think about when we do studies on these spaces, but it's really interesting to see how we can like measure those messages, for example, those conversations online.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah, I think I would like to add to what Caleb is saying. For us, mostly for researchers, we do not have the wherewithal to connect directly with the tech companies, and so we do most of this data collection and research using Facebook independently by ourselves. Depending on what kind of data we are going to use, we would also, it's depending, it's going to be qualitative or just quantitative analysis of the data that we need to do. That would inform what kind of people or what kind of data would be involved in this. But for the Nigerian context, and I'm going back to your second question about polarizing conversations moving from private spaces to public spaces. In the Nigerian context, Facebook has kind of been relegated to that app that is not used by a lot of young people. Most of the people who use Facebook right now use it for marketing purposes, and also it's actually mostly the elderly in the Nigerian context who use Facebook a lot for conversations. You find the conversations in Nigeria, most of them, I would say, maybe not all of them, but the conversations in Nigeria that are ongoing on Facebook are not like politically sensitive or conflict sensitive conversations like that. They're more about social issues and private life conversations, something like that. But where it all happens is actually Twitter. And so because of this, I would say that I don't see most of the polarizing conversations that happen in private spaces, for example, on private message parts of Facebook. I don't see them coming public. I don't know, because also, like I said, the terrorist groups and the conflict contexts that utilize social media, they do not use it for recruitment purposes. And so because of this, mostly private conversations will stay private. I don't see most people, and because people like for a conversation to become polarizing enough to cause conflict, the attention economy has to be stimulated. And if you don't have the attention on Facebook, you would always come to the places where you can get the people who would listen and the people who would engage with you. And because of this, with Facebook, no, Twitter is more where it all happens.
Yeah, if you, I see you've just posted a link, so that'd be really interesting if you could explain that a bit more.
Yeah, I think this link, this link is to the public data studio that the Myanmar Tech Accountability Network has built. So Phandeeyar is part of this, but obviously we have a lot of other partners, and it goes to what Cal was asking about how we gather data. So this is in part, or it's largely data we gathered through CrowdTangle, which obviously has its limitations because it is a Facebook tool, and it's, you know, we're only allowed to gather sort of what Facebook decides is available at the time, and it's only all public data. But I think in a lot of different contexts, what is public is very useful to know, because in part, when at least for me, when I see a lot of these conversations moving into smaller groups, I count it as a partial success, right? Because a lot of the disinformation campaigns and a lot of these sort of harmful things are only as effective as they are public. And the more effort we can make these bad actors put into spreading their messages or whatever harm that they're trying to do, I think the more we are succeeding, because I don't think they're going to stop, right? There are, you know, whether it's the military, whether it's whatever institution that is in power that's trying to either cling to their power or increase their power, they will be able to pay people or entice people to continue doing the negative work that they want to do. And so I think as peace builders, while we can't necessarily stop them unless we get sort of government and other institutional partners on board, in the meantime, we can make their lives a lot harder. We can make their work reach fewer people for the amount of effort they're putting in. So in part, I think people moving on to these private platforms or more private platforms can be counted as a success. And I think to address the issue of privacy concerns as well, at least for Phandeeyar and for a lot of our partners, we don't see that much of a problem in us being part of these groups and joining these like group messages and joining these private Facebook groups, because they're meant for people in Myanmar who are interested in Myanmar. We are people in Myanmar who are interested in Myanmar. And so there's no reason for us to not join these groups. Obviously, as private groups, the people in them, we can't ask them to consent to be monitored. But I think in being part of them, we can at least on a personal level, without applying these larger data tools, still have a sense of the conversation that's happening in these more private spaces in the way that any other person who is in that group would be able to. And I think that's kind of how we see the balance of not violating people's privacy rights or expectations, but at the same time, not fully ceding this ground to the actors who are operating these more private spaces online.
So yes, but really interesting, and again, kind of different views on how to kind of approach those spaces, and also just showing how deeply contextual the way people using these platforms in each country is again. you know, whether those conversations are going on Facebook or on Twitter and different, you know, and where those are. And I think really interesting in terms of the addressing the ethical concerns, like as citizens, it's a space for everyone. If you're accepted into those spaces, then yeah, that's a really interesting point as well. So really fascinating insights from everyone. And I think, again, what it highlights, given the kind of vastness of, you know, as you say, Cal, we're trying to play catch up. And I think to what A said earlier, you know, like collaboration is key, not just in working towards our advocacy, maybe with tech companies, but also like, you know, we can all see a little bit of the picture and we can only do so much with the time we have. So like, how do we build those links with one another where we can, you know, share what we do know? And I think that was a really nice point, A, as you said, like it might not be useful for us, but it might be something we found out, but it might be useful to someone else. So how do we actually make sure that we're able to share with one another these things from our different contexts and how we're working? So yeah, I think that is something that would be really good to kind of think about. And yeah, just also just to say, as we have 2 minutes left, so yeah, just to say thank you so much to our amazing panelists and all of you for participating as well. And yeah, like thank you to well, the British Council for partnering with us on this, and Build-Up for also helping with the research. The paper was very much a starting point for conversations like this. And I know at Build-Up as well, it's all about like having follow-up conversations. So do like grab one another in those informal spaces and like follow up on things. I know a lot of you are working, a lot of us are working on some of the same things. So it'll be nice to kind of follow up on those. And we'll, as I said, we'll post a link to the research in there. And yeah, just really, really very interesting. So thanks very much for joining and enjoy the rest of the conference. We hope to see you at some other sessions as well.